Did you ever wonder, does cancer act differently in a growing body? How often does cancer occur in children? And does it happen as often as it does in adults? And are the same treatments used no matter how old the patient is? Find out the answers to this and more on Things That Make You Go, huh?
Things That Make You Go, huh?
Hello, everyone. It's your science-challenged host, Brett Hellman, and I'm still coming to you live today from sunny California. Our Things That Make You Go, huh? road trip continues as we pick the brains of more of our AbbVie West Coast colleagues. Normally, I'd find some creative way to introduce our topic, but today's subject matter really doesn't lend itself to humor. We had the opportunity to talk to someone who has particular expertise in pediatric-oncology, and while this isn't something anyone wants to think about, the truth is, as I've often wondered, well, really anytime I've heard of a child getting sick, I immediately think about what can be done to make them better. So let's just get to it. My producer Suzanne and I are here today with a very special guest to shed some light on this very important topic. Lastly, just as a reminder, we didn't have our normal audio guy with us on our road trip, and I was responsible for recording this myself, so please excuse any issues in sound quality. So with that, let's introduce our guest today, Laurie Styles. Laurie, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
I'm Laurie Styles, and I am a senior medical director with Pharmacyclics in Sunnyvale. I am the graft versus host disease clinical development lead, as well as the lead for pediatric development at Pharmacyclics.
Perfect. Great. We'll get right to it. So I think our first question today is, how are cancers different in children than they are in adults?
Well, there's overlap for one, but in general, pediatric cancers are biologically different. They're often much more aggressive and assertive in a slow fashion, or in a fast way. And then adult cancers are often slower or more chronic, such as chronic lymphocytic leukemia versus acute leukemia in children. Although acute leukemia can occur in adults as well, but it's just in general, the biology seems to be different, with pediatric cancers in general being more aggressive.
Do we know why that is?
I think it's driven by the biology. There are genetic influences on both adult cancers and pediatric cancers, but though there might be acute leukemia in children and acute leukemia in adults, how they respond to therapies and the genetics that underlie them often are different. So it's really a sort of, I think, biologically driven.
Interesting. So there are cancers that I've heard of that are like specifically childhood cancers, correct?
Yes, there are some cancers that occur predominantly in children, and then some cancers that occur in adults that don't occur in children. Again, as chronic lymphocytic leukemia, CLL, doesn't occur in children.
Do cancers present themselves differently in children than they do in adults? If it's like pancreatic cancer or a specific type of cancer, does it look different in a child than it does in an adult?
It can, and it depends on the type of cancer. For one, pancreatic cancer is extraordinarily rare in children, or even sort of late adolescents. And it really depends on the cancer. Blood cancers might present similarly between adults and children, but the solid tumors like pancreatic cancer, obviously there's not a real equivalent in children, so it wouldn't obviously be expected to present in the same way. But it really depends on the cancer.
And does cancer act differently in a growing body? I would think, if our adults are kind of stagnant. I know cells are always changing, but adults are kind of done deals, right? But kids are growing, and there's just bones growing and cells dividing, right? So does that impact how the cancer acts?
Not so much. I will say that there are cancers, something like hepatoblastoma, which only really occurs in a very, very young child, usually under 2 or 3, that would, only really occur in children, and is probably reflective of the fact that child's liver and body is growing. I think where most of the concerns with cancer in children come is in the impact of the therapy, right? So in general, I would say that children tolerate chemotherapy better. They're healthier. They don't have, decades of hard living or just, wear and tear on the body. But we do worry about the impact of the therapies on a developing body. So it's not so much the cancer itself, but how we go about treating it and its impact on a developing body. For example, something that would be expected to impact bone growth or organs that affect endocrine function, hormonal function, those would have a particularly deleterious effect on a child simply because they need those hormones to become, to fully mature. So it's interrupting growth, interrupting development, or having, irreversible effects on those, systems that I think is probably the most relevant in terms of treating and cancer's impact on children.
Can the same treatments be used in children as an adult?
There's a lot of overlap between the medicines, the chemotherapies, or now the targeted agents in pediatric and adult cancers. It's possible that a drug will work in both manifestations. Let's say lymphoma. Lymphoma occurs in children, and lymphoma occurs in adults. The types of lymphoma are different in general. There's some overlap, obviously. So one might use the same, quote, lymphomatous drugs to treat lymphoma in an adult and children. How well they work might differ, though, between the two. So the same therapies are used, but often in different combinations, different doses, and they take different approaches. One, toxicity. As I've said, children often will tolerate a higher relative dose of a drug than an adult, just as an older adult compared to a younger adult doesn't tolerate chemotherapy. So they can get a different dose, and so that can impact things as well.
So you started out as a clinician, correct?
Yes, I was a pediatric hematologist, oncologist.
Where did you practice?
Prior to coming to Pharmacyclics, I was a pediatric hematologist at Children's Hospital in Oakland. And I think that's had a major impact on me as an individual and in my role here at Pharmacyclics. Children's Hospital Oakland is an institution that treats children from all ways of life and is an incredibly diverse population. And I was able to essentially, I was exposed to how disease impacts families in different ways, how that manifests for them. So that in coming to Pharmacyclics, I have that information and I have that experience that I can then share with the team here in terms of guiding us on what we do and in trying to impact, the experience of having a child with cancer and how to really make that better and to have a positive impact on these families.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, because I would think that when you're doing science, right, and you're developing medications, I mean, on one level, it's going to be about what's in that petri dish or on that computer or whatever it is, but we also have to think really holistically about how that medication is going to interact in the real world, right?
Yeah, and I agree with that completely because, even in just terms of designing a study, you have to keep in mind, what is real world, right? So you can develop a drug for a set of conditions, but if that doesn't occur in the real world, then it has no applicability for these people. So you have to develop what I would consider a clinically relevant study. Because even if it's successful, if it's not clinically relevant, then you've done nothing really to help the patient, or you've done little to help really the patient and the family and what they're experiencing.
So what made you decide to go into research instead?
Well, as a clinical pediatric hematologist and oncologist,
That's a lot of words.
Yes, it is. here in California, I actually did do clinical research, translational and clinical research. So I had a fair amount of research experience and drug development in the context of my clinical career. So the reason I moved was that I had a good experience with another pharmaceutical company and really saw that was really attracted to the focus and the attention and the efforts put into the rapid development of therapies for not just children. I really felt like when efforts were focused, things got done and got done quicker. And time is an important element for patients, right? And in particular, children. If you wait until you've done, a definitive study, the longer it takes, the more time it means that there are children that have this condition and aren't treated, and that can be a matter of life and death for them. So, in essence, I was encouraged and intrigued by the concept of being able to do things, do them well and rigorously, and do them quickly.
So on that note, what is drug development like for children versus adults? I mean, I would assume it's the same, right, in terms of having the FDA approvals and enough clinical research?
It's actually quite different.
Really?
And it's really related to the fact that, and if we want to speak specifically about oncology, because there are conditions that affect children equally, such as infections as adults. But if you're speaking about oncology, it's different simply because oncologic or cancer in children is a rare disease.
Really?
Every single type of cancer in children, it would meet the criteria for a rare disease in this country. That makes it difficult simply, to do a study. You can't do a 2,000 patient study or it's very difficult to do a 2,000 patient study in a particular type of pediatric cancer simply because it could take you years to accrue that number of patients. And as I've said, that's years spent where then children potentially wouldn't have access to something that could be very, very efficacious. So, the sort of burden of proof and the studies necessary for pediatric approval are different than in adults. And in general, you have to show a benefit in a disease that occurs in both or has similarities in both. You have to show that there has been some evidence of benefit in an adult counterpart to that disease. Now, there are diseases that only occur in children, so you would never be able to do that. There are a limited number of patients. So it's not really a matter of how much energy you put into it. It's just those patients don't exist. So overall, I would say that pediatric development is really quite different than adult, and the considerations that go into it are very, very different.
I feel like I hear about childhood leukemia more than any other kind of childhood cancer. Is that just perception, or is that a cancer that happens more often?
That is that and brain tumors are the most common pediatric malignancies.
And do we know why? Is there a reason that blood cancer and brain cancer are more?
I'm not probably knowledgeable to know why. I mean, leukemias are also very, very common in adults.
Right.
Probably not as much as some of the solid tumors, like breast cancer or lung cancer, and I don't honestly know the numbers. But I think, again, a lot of the solid tumors are due to sort of lifelong or decades-long exposure to things. So they have a different sort of etiology. I think it makes sense that if someone has a genetic predisposition to something, that a leukemia would be the place where that happens because of, it's an origin in the actual stem cells of the hematologic system. But I don't know that anyone knows, in particular why. But as I mentioned, hepatoblastoma is also, hepatoblast is sort of like, if you will, the stem cell of the hepatic cells. So it's in those early cells. So if a person is going to develop a cancer or a malignancy in childhood, it will often come from those early cells.
So, Brett, I feel like I'm monopolizing this conversation. Do you have any
I'm just trying to
questions?
absorb it all. It's a lot of information. I'm sure it's a struggle on your end, but it was a struggle for me just to understand all of it.
Well, you make a very good point, and you're not alone. It is a very complex area, and but I think it's important, to convey the message that the development in pediatrics is very different than it is in adults, and it's very complex. So I, lead the pediatric program here at Pharmacyclics, but I think I can honestly say that a lot of my colleagues here, even in clinical development, don't have the same level of understanding that you have, that don't understand really the complexity of pediatric development and what's been put into place to both promote pediatric research, but also to keep patients safe.
I think the other thing that to me that was surprising was that any diseases in kids are considered rare diseases, and that if you need
Just for oncology.
just for oncology, I'm sorry. So it's if you need to do clinical trials, you can't find enough kids necessarily to do those clinical trials. So I think that was kind of eye-opening for me as well.
Yeah, so I think you make an important point about the rarity. It's obviously, as I've said, all the oncologic conditions are rare, and that makes it really hard to do the research. Not only in terms of finding the patients and having an adequate number of patients to sort of ask a test. Normally we have a very rigorous statistical evaluation of things. That's often not possible. You don't have the numbers necessary, and it wouldn't be possible to accumulate those number of patients. It gets further complex now in the age of targeted agents and molecularly directed therapies, in that you might have more than one drug, either in the same class or from a different angle, addressing the same disease. So then you have multiple drugs being targeted for the same condition. So then you're not only just trying to find the patients, but you're competing with someone else to actually investigate your agent. So numerically, it's a challenge just to even do the study.
So my question is, how do you move forward then in that type of situation where you don't have enough patients, you have multiple drugs, right? So
Well, often, if it's a really rare condition, we don't. Let's say it doesn't occur in children under 1, or under 2 or under 5. They won't make you do that kind of work in those patients simply because they realize it's so rare. There are other conditions, though, that if you want to, what you do is you have to design a study that is rigorous and will give you, confidence that this can be used. But again, this is where the clinicians are left, that in that intervening period, what do you do? Because those studies, that data may never come through. And so it's really hard. And just as an example, it's not even just efficacy. We're talking about, pharmacokinetics, which is dosing. How do we know how to dose? Can you just take an average 80 kilogram person, and then when you give it to a 20 kilogram child, cut the dose in a quarter?
Yeah.
Doesn't usually work that way.
So that's interesting, because it's like that goes back to that whole concept of, back in the day they used to, before medical science evolved, we considered children like tiny adults, right? There was this whole thing I remember reading in like the 17th century where they were that's what they thought kids were, little miniature adults. So that kind of speaks to that point of they're not, right? It's not just a weight. So like let's say you have an 80 pound adult female, which, there are some, not me, but there are some. And then you have an 80 pound 10-year-old boy. Those are still two very different bodies, right? In terms of how drugs are going to interact?
Well, they can be. They might not be, but they can be. And I have to say that clinical pharmacology people have, come a long way in being able to predict, will an 80 pound boy and an 80 pound, 90-year-old respond the same way? There's a lot of changes in the maturity of enzymes and in the liver, or even in how we process these medications. So it really depends on the drug. It's not so much a 10-year-old, because I think for most 12 and ups, those probably are small adults.
So even for reproductive reasons, so I would think, because with puberty, people are.
Well, we have lots of safeguards in place for reproduction in even adults.
Right.
But I guess my point is the difference between a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old. Probably not a lot. There's some body weight differences. A girl wouldn't have been expected, or a boy, to have fully matured at that point in terms of body weight and muscle mass. But in terms of the enzymes that are needed to break down the drug that result in a particular exposure, those might be fully mature. Some drugs are metabolized by enzymes that are mature after a year of age. So it's really complex. And as I've said, I think that's where clinical pharmacology has helped us a lot in trying to predict these things. And when you design a study looking to see what dose should I give children, you always err on the safety, because though it's not common, there's always the potential for a child to have a toxicity that you don't see in adults. And this has happened with other drugs, but in a child, if you gave them something that you could leave them with an irreversible, problem or toxicity.
I think you bring up a good point, which is that, in children, they're growing so quickly as opposed to when you're older in life. So it's kind of like a moving target, right? So when you're putting drugs into a body that's developing so quickly, I don't know if this is kind of a dumb question or not, but doesn't that make it a little bit more complex too, to create drugs for children as well?
Absolutely. And we have a particular focus on growth and development. So that would be growth, muscle, bone, and then, hormonal, right? Because that's the big change that's going on in puberty is, full sexual, maturation. So you don't want to do something in that period of time where you could, you would potentially hurt them for the long term. And I will say that in pediatrics, that we have a lot of effective therapies in cancer, right? We do actually do much better in children in terms of curing cancer than we do in adults. And so a focus and something that's always in study design is how to minimize toxicity, because this isn't a 60-year-old who's going to have a problem for maybe 20 more years. This is a 10-year-old who may have to have a bad hip from avascular necrosis for 70 years. And the impact of that is not just on having a bad hip, but in gaining employment and being active. So the implications of toxicities in children have so many more years to impact over. So it's we're always balancing toxicity with sort of with cure, because in pediatrics we're always going for a cure. Control is not sort of our usual goal, but so we have to balance reaching a cure, but at what expense? And that's where I think that pediatric cancer's made a lot of progress, and we design studies to minimize toxicity and maintain. So if we have some diseases where we do very well, if we can minimize toxicity but keep the same success rate, then that's an important accomplishment. So I think what your point about it's growth and development, it's a moving target. You don't always know what's gonna happen, and so it has to be in drug development for pediatrics, pharmacokinetics or developing the right dose and looking at toxicity are really the really important things. I mean, obviously efficacy is important, but one can't count out that toxicity side of things.
So my next question is more on a personal level. So, I mean, I think any type of disease at any age is upsetting and can be hard to take. But I think in kids, it seems particularly more heart-wrenching. So I'm just curious, what inspires you to come to work every day and do what you do?
That's, an issue that gets brought up to me all the time. Oh, I could never do what you do, seeing those kids with cancer or sickle cell disease or, any of these diseases. I guess it's the thought that this is going to happen whether I'm here or not, and my desire to do what I can to make the patient and their family, do not discount the impact of disease on the family, anything I can do to make that condition better and to have the family and the child be more successful. And that's what drives me. And I actually feel I am inspired by the patients and their families themselves. They are amazing. And often it's the people with the least. I mean, in terms of economics or, cultural, the people that are the most downtrodden and have the very least in order to do that actually accomplish the most for their child. So, the families that are just barely making it by, and I'm tearing up now just because it is what
So sweet.
It is what drives, I think, most people in pediatric hematology oncology. But I view being able to take care of these children and try to do something for them and their families as a real gift. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that.
Well, they're lucky to have you. That's awesome. Is this what you wanted to be when you were a kid? I always like to ask that question. What did you want to be when you were a kid?
Well, interestingly, I wanted to be a veterinarian.
Oh, okay.
But I made the decision that I did not to do that because I couldn't stand the sight of blood. I've always found it quite, I don't know if it's ironic or because I never use that word correctly, but that I ended up in pediatric hematology oncology, but where all I deal with is blood. But I think that first career choice of a veterinarian reflects my desire to help others, be that a human or an animal.
That's cool.
So from the beginning of your career to now and looking forward, how have things changed in terms of your hope for the future?
I guess people always, people will say, when are we going to cure cancer? And to me, that was, always kind of a silly question. That'd be like saying, how are we going to cure disease? Because it's such a broad group of diseases. And I guess I've always viewed cancer as something, as the potential rather than this cure for cancer, as a control for cancer, of how to restore normalcy, or how, because cancer is really just something turning itself on and never turning itself off and not ever following the natural progression of life and death of a cell. So I am really encouraged and excited by the fact that we now know so much more about what drives cells, what drives the immune system, that we can go in there and sort of tinker with the machinery, if you will, to fix things and to get them back to a more normal function, as opposed to in the past just going ahead and, if you will, hitting that cell on the head with a hammer. And so that to me is a much more eloquent, scientifically and biologically way of approaching disease in general, but in particular cancer.
Thank you so much, Laurie.
Yes,
this
Laurie,
was
thank
great.
you so much.
And I personally understood all of it. What about you, Brett?
I feel so much smarter right now.
I'm sure you are. So what did you learn today?
One of the interesting things I learned, I think, was that in oncology, at least, that most diseases for kids are considered rare diseases. Is that
right.
correct?
Pediatric cancers are rare.
Also, that drug development in pediatric oncology is quite complex. It involves a lot more regulation and things that I never even kind of considered.
Like clinical trials, even finding the patients, right? That was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
That you can't necessarily find enough patients to get the results that you need.
And to answer the questions, most importantly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think lastly, one of the things I learned and thought was eye-opening was just kind of the potential side effects for these kids, only because in treating them, you have to think about kind of the long-term effects for them 70, 80 years, down the line. So that was definitely insightful for me as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that you've recognized, because you didn't understand that the toxicity and the long-term quality of life is part of the equation, and that's something that we actually have to discuss with families and discuss even amongst ourselves when we're deciding on a course of action. Obviously, everyone wants to go in, hit this thing hard, and get rid of it. But that's not necessarily always the right choice. If you keep in mind what the long-term quality of life is for a sub-patient who's going to live potentially 70 or 80 years. So it's a consideration in everything we do. And we design trials, actually, even to try to minimize toxicity and yet maintain the same efficacy. So efficacy is obviously the primary focus, but one can't lose sight of what are the side effects and what is this patient's long-term quality of life going to be.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Things that make you go, huh?